art. I really want this evening to be about you, the audience, and I want everybody to have an opportunity to ask Maria questions. We probably don't have time for everyone to ask questions, but we will have time for many of you. But I thought I'd start out this evening just by just asking you a couple of things, just to kind of get some ideas out there. And so, for example, you've spoken about arts and the place of creativity in education and its importance. One of the challenges we sometimes have as educators now, not just as directors, but as educators, is we have parents who want their students, they're naturally concerned about their future, their economic security, and are maybe a little scared when their sons and daughters want to pursue a career in the arts. So what advice do you have, not just for the students themselves or for the young people, but for the parents? How should they think about this?
Yeah, I think that universities, as well as cultural institutions, actually have an obligation to lobby the parents about the opportunities that the creative careers can provide. And we've done some really interesting work at Tate over the last 2 years, running a day-long event called Roots In. And actually all we've done is bring together the incredible diversity of people that already work for Tate, from the conservation scientists to the accountants, to the curators, to the visitor experience people, to the marketers, to the social media officer. And we host them in the Tate Exchange area of Tate, which is level 5 in the new part of Tate Modern. And then we invite parents and students to come and find out what you could be if you worked at Tate. Because we have terrible old-fashioned stereotypes. You think everyone inside Tate is somehow a curator. No. My head of finance will tell you the most interesting finance job in the whole of London is being the finance director at Tate. He said, I'm dealing with the money for really, really fascinating, weird things. And he said, that is much better than straightforward spreadsheets. And most of our scientists who do the work on how do you protect that paint from Liverpool's incessant rain, they trained as scientists never imagining that they would practice that science in the arts. And I think we need to understand much more thoroughly how diverse the arts and cultural sector is. And when I think forward, I mean, I really worry about the UK education system at the present time, possibly more than I worry about Brexit, to be honest, because it's going to have a longer term generational impact that we're driving young people down a narrow academic route, maths, science, STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, maths, when what we need is STEAM. You do need the science and technology, but you need the arts in it, because the world's changing so fast. We need people who can think about things that don't yet exist. And the process of testing and failure within the arts is an incredibly good training ground for thinking about uncertainty. And I'm certain that we're going to be living in a perpetual age of uncertainty. And we did some research with the University of Nottingham quite recently, along with the RSC in the UK, about the experience of students in arts-rich schools. So where we thought they were getting it right. The research is absolutely conclusive that all of these young people are doing better at school against their peers in non-arts rich environments, and they've got the language to describe it. So they know how it's helping them, how it makes them better team players, sharper critical thinkers, better able to deal with challenge and change. And you think, why wouldn't governments want this? And we've been lobbying the universities in the UK, especially the Russell Group, the more powerful universities, because they were inadvertently doing things to discourage young people taking arts subjects. So they called them facilitative subjects. I said, oh, get a grip. So, yeah, I'll do the facilitative thing. And they've abolished that term now, thankfully, because of lobbying from the arts sector. So I think we need to understand that the arts is not soft. It's probably the best training for an increasingly fluid and challenging world.
So let me ask a question about, not to be irritating, but a question about the gendered nature of leadership. And I say not to be irritating because I actually have worked very hard not to call attention, not to call too much attention to the fact that you're a woman leader, a female leader. What's more important is you're a leader. What's most important is that you run a major organization. But what are the challenges for gendered leadership? What are the issues that you've confronted? And I don't just mean the trivial things. There are many things I've read where people have commented on the way you dress, or they've made certain, and the usual stereotypes about women and leadership. Maybe reflect a little bit on that for us. What have been some challenges? Maybe what have been some triumphs? What have been ways in which gender has actually been a tremendous asset for you?
Well, I mean, you point to some of the difficulties. It is trying, to say the least, to still have journalists comment on what I'm wearing, what my shoes are, and say, you don't do that. Tristram Hunt was appointed 2 months before me, and he was a surprise appointment. He'd been an MP. He'd never worked in an arts organisation, but nobody wrote about his shoes. And in that Times article that broke my story, the second comment down was about my gold shoes that they had seen on Instagram. So it's sexist. And I think there's also quite a keenness for people to say, oh, but it's not really sexist now. So, yes, it is, actually. It's still really quite sexist. And it needs to be much better. And younger generations, again, my own son would go, Mum, that's rubbish, He said, our generation, we don't talk like that. I said, good, Jake. Keep on with that. So, because it is getting a bit better, but it still needs to change a lot more. And I've had to learn to be more guarded. I was a bit too frank when I was in Manchester, and so there were a bit too many photographs of gold shoes for journalists to pick up on. There are less of those now. But part of it, again, one of the first articles about me talked about my yoga and my ex-husband, which I really thought was out of order, as well as my children. And we should, as a collective, challenge that when we see it. Again, my son would say the men need to challenge that, as well as the women, because it isn't serving any of us. And so I think that's one of the gender. I try not to talk about it too much, but I know that there is a simultaneous. It doesn't matter that I'm a woman. I got the job at Tate because of the long career experience I've had. But of course it does matter, because it does matter that I'm the first female to lead the organisation. But Kaywin Feldman just recently was appointed at the National Gallery in Washington. And the first director of the Musée d'Orsay, Wang, is a woman. So it's going to change really rapidly, which is fantastic. I think the other side of it is that Mary Portas, the entrepreneur in the UK, has recently written a book called Leading Like a Woman. And her point is you don't have to be one to lead like one. And that is a useful lesson. What the book is actually about is an argument for distributed, flexible, empathetic leadership. And there was a bit in my talk that I forgot to say, which is that classic leadership, sort of Napoleon leadership, wasn't actually that great, Napoleon. That kind of leadership is about focus and, standing strong and sticking to your views and being really determined. So those are terrible characteristics for modern times, where we need to be more mutable. And if we're going to listen, you actually have to change your mind. Changing your mind as a leader used to be seen as a bad thing, but it isn't if it's purposeful and principled. And so I genuinely think we are going through a time that needs different leadership models, and that a differently gendered model is emerging. And again, younger generations are saying, and those genders, they aren't binary anymore, and they don't belong by nature to anybody. And so we want a form of leadership that can speak to those generations.
And then finally, for me, so audience members get ready, you're next. I want to ask you a little bit about the mission. Actually, you quoted Tristram more than once, and I'm glad you did, because he was actually here last year in the same series.
Right.
So great minds think alike, or at least appear on the same stage. And one of the things you commented on was the way in which he mentioned how museums have to be a place where, safe place, where dangerous ideas can, or at least complicated, difficult ideas can be shared and discussed. You know, this is a very different context over here in Asia and in China. And I wonder if you have any thoughts, any advice even for directors of government-funded museums in particular, maybe less so private, but government-funded museums. How do you deal with artists who are controversial politically, where the consequences can often be far greater maybe than just you know, a nasty op-ed piece, but in fact can lead to far more significant consequences. Do you have any thoughts about that? Is it just a barrier we should just push against and just let what come may? Or is it something that really takes, or I don't know, I mean, I'm asking really, I mean, how do you think about that?
Well, I mean, we have the luxury of a relative tolerance to protest in the UK, not absolutely, but there is a quite kind of comfortable space for it. And I remember being here in Hong Kong with Daniel when the umbrella protests were happening, and some of the participants in the course were involved in them, or had students and colleagues who were. And the very real dangers associated with that are not very often felt in the UK. But nevertheless, I think the arts has to hold its ethical ground, however difficult government control might be. And I think that applies to us as much in the UK as it does here, in that the publics that we're engaged with require that of us. So in recent months within Tate Modern, we've seen protests about Brexit. Tanya Bruguera was our Turbine Hall commissioned artist, and she herself staged a protest against the Cuban government within our spaces. We had a protest about a corporate sponsor that we had. I'm with you, corporate sponsors are great, but they have their own baggage as well. So the cleaners of a particular high-level corporate sponsor picketed outside the exhibition they were sponsoring. And we have to take that in our stride. And I think it's about, again, creating a sense of as much safety as you can around that. And I've been talking to the director of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam a lot about this, where they had a whole successive series of protests about their acceptance of BP sponsorship, which is something Tate experienced in the years before I came. And I think in the end, institutionally, we had to weigh up how much damage does that protest do to the organisation, perceptions about the organisation. But if we try to stop the protest, then we do something even worse. And I think one of the things we've been working through is how we can grow our tolerance for those who disagree with us and say they're allowed to be here. And if it's said in that tone, whether it's here in Hong Kong or elsewhere, we allow the arts to dissent, but not to throw missiles. And I think carving out that space for constructive disagreement is the terrain we should be on.
Terrific. Okay, let's open it up to the audience. Any questions for Maria? Yeah, sure, right here in front. We'll have microphones coming around.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria, for yet another invigorating talk. I'm from ACLP, and I just graduated from CLOR last year. I want to ask about the gender pay gap. I was reading up on the arts professional, and it's a real thing that's happening. I was just wondering, in your new leadership in the Tate, what practical measures have been taken to bridge the gap?
Well, at Tate we have a gender pay gap that's against men rather than against women. I'm not kidding, it's true, which I'm very pleased about. It was 50-50 before I came, or balanced before I came, and me coming and Nick stepping down tipped us over to, we're by We're biased against men, I'm very sorry. Really, really marginally. And that is how it should be in a museum like mine. Museums around the world, you will find typically a majority female workforce. I mean, at Tate, it's about 65% women to 35% men. But you didn't used to see those women reflected at the most senior levels in organisations, and that's beginning to change. Tony Hall worked at the Royal Opera House and then moved to the BBC and has found himself facing the most horrific gender disparities within the BBC, and they are having to change it so quickly because it's not acceptable anymore. And I think there are some things that stay the same for a really, really, really long time, and everyone can give you, of course, Jeremy Paxman is particularly talented, and that's why he earns so much more than Kirsty Walk. It's rubbish, actually, and it's having to change. And that's really good, because I then think my generation is doing the right kind of work so that the generations that come after us will just experience equity as the norm, and we shouldn't think that that's extraordinary. That's just how it should be.
Hi, I'm glad you brought up the issue of corporate sponsorships, because I was going to ask you that anyway. And I'm curious to know that with the Tate, I think it stopped taking money from BP in 2017. Joined. The BP was a huge donor, and now you've stopped taking money from the Sackler family. Again, another huge donor. So have we come to a point when the whole system of taking corporate sponsorships has to change for major international arts institutions? Will we start seeing, for example, for the sake of risk management, that institutions will stop taking one big lump sum from one entity? And on a related note, I would also be interested to hear your thoughts on patrons. We had Princess Alia of Libya this morning at Art Basel talking about the role of young collectors. Many of them are friends, and they all want to be in the Tate International Council, which is great, and they're influencers. At the same time, nothing comes free. What is the risk of relying so much on the 1% and their friends? And how does that chime with the Tate being a place for a diversity of voices?
Well, you've got Ariane from fundraising in the front. You can speak to her afterwards. She can give you kind of the real life story of it. These are really important questions of our time. The context is, for Tate, 30% of our funding comes from the government, which is not very much. The rest we fundraise or we earn ourselves. We earn through ticket sales and our shops and our cafes and touring exhibitions and so on. But corporate sponsorship, individual sponsorship is a huge amount of, the three legs of the stool are the money we earn, the money we fundraise, the money the government gives us. And so we cannot avoid being engaged in questions of the ethical responsibilities of taking that money. And for Tate, it's gone back a long time, not to 2017 or BP sponsorship. Or actually, an ethics committee was formed at Tate, made up of independent members more than a decade ago now. And every sponsor that we have, whether it's an individual or a corporate organisation, goes through scrutiny. Goes through the scrutiny of our ethics committee. I'm sure your university has a similar practice. And they challenge us to say, first, is the money clean? Are the guns, defence stuff, cigarettes, sex workers? All of those things are no-nos. And we say no to things, and we need to say no to things, because in the end we're a public organisation. So we have to live by good standards and the high standards of kind of public scrutiny. But if we didn't make any partnerships with corporate organisations, we simply wouldn't be able to open the doors at Tate. And you know, if my radical democratic side might say, I would like every single exhibition to be free. But that won't actually help anybody, because it means that many of those exhibitions won't happen at all. And so it'll be open to no one. So there's a balance to be drawn here. And for me, in the end, there just has to be rigour around that ethical scrutiny. So we did take money from the Sackler Foundation, and it was entirely proper to do so. They have been generous donors to Tate. We took money from the foundations long before the OxyContin issues came to light. And after long consideration, the ethics committee finally we didn't send money back. We simply said, in the present time, we won't take any more, because there were a whole series of legal cases going on that we don't know the resolution of yet. So we just have to make our best judgment in the time that we're in, and accept that in the future, the situation might change. When Tate took BP money first, there really was barely any environmental campaigning going on. You fast forward 15 years, and in the end, that campaigning brought the organisation to draw a different conclusion. So, you know, we operate in the world, and we've just got to use our best intelligence to make reasonable decisions, knowing that in the end we're a charity, and we take that money and discharge public benefit from it. So we would never give the Sackler money back now, because it's already benefited the public, and that's a good thing. The good thing about UK institutions, this might not be the case everywhere else in the world, I don't know every situation, but there is a considerable arm's length between a donor and a patron and what Tate does. So our donors and patrons don't sit on our board. Our board is appointed by government, so they have an independence. You can be on an acquisition committee to help Tate raise money to buy work from Asia Pacific, but you don't get to pick the work yourself. The curators do the research and bring those works to the group. And I think we've evolved ways of, again, being ethical in those relationships. So of course, those wealthy patrons enjoy their relationship with Tate, but they don't dictate what we do. And actually, they are helping public access to the arts, because we take their contributions and it helps make the collection be able to be shown for free, keeps the exhibition costs down, allows us to tour things across the nation. And so I think that's quite a good exchange. The 1%'s money starts to benefit the 8 million, which is a good thing.
The 1% is complicated, because some of them too are opening private museums, and this is an entirely different phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
And becoming arbiters of the public taste to some extent anyway.
Yeah.
So do you see, I mean, apart from their interest in the Tate itself, do you see public, or rather this 1% actually, in a way, working against the public interest out of their own private enthusiasm for art, or their own tax interests, or whatever they may be, but ultimately working against the public interest?
Yeah, I think you are witnessing, particularly in this region, an exponential expansion of that, and you see some of those private museums setting out a public mission, and others not at all interested in it, and I think we just have to walk carefully through that. And so for us as a public institution, we typically wouldn't make a partnership with an entirely private museum, because the public benefit test is the thing that we consider. And you know, there are some wonderful philanthropists who've gathered collections, and just, I don't make judgments about those things, but for Tate and its relationships and partnerships, there always has to be a public benefit.
Next question, one over there, yeah.
Thank you. It's a very impressive talk. So my question is less about the art scene, but more about your personal stories. So you talk about how you grew up, and then you now now land this leadership position. So I just wonder, it's a very fine line between being stubborn and being persistent. So I just wonder, in your personal life and also in your work life now as a leader, were there moments that you think, well, when you should push forward, but then when you should say back off and let go of something? What's going on in your minds when you have to make these decisions? Thanks.
I think there's a number of answers to that. I think it's often quite useful to be stubborn but be very charming about it, so that you don't look so stubborn, because sometimes you do need to stand your ground. Persistence, though, is a much more interesting term, because it's often about testing things again and again, and not just holding to the same view, but actually trying things different ways. And that, to me, is a much undervalued quality that really does breed new thinking. And I think in the leadership role that I hold now, the thing that I've had to learn most is actually how not to sweat the small stuff, to actually let some things go. And so the decision about where I should stand my ground really does depend on the impact it makes in the world. We should stop fussing about table decorations and really start thinking, are we working in the right parts of the world with the right people, and is there a public benefit to it? And that allows me to decide when to be really determined and say, I won't let this one go. And the other one, well, I wouldn't have done it that way, but who cares? Life is too short. And you need both of those kind of qualities, I think.
There's a question there, yeah.
Hi, Maria, I'm Helen. Thank you so much for your sharing. I identify with you so much. Being a social entrepreneur, as a leader in the company, we work with corporates, we work with investors, or many powerful people. So in your charming leadership, of course, you can talk to powerful people as equals, but young people like us, like as a young leader, how do you talk with powerful people or negotiate terms, or how do you do it when you're younger as a leader?
I think you have to do it in an evidence-based way, because what you're talking about is feeling that you don't have the right or the platform to say, you need to listen to me. But actually, when I talk about the working relationship I had with a very powerful leader of Manchester Council, I came to realise that he needed me, because I would go away and really think about things and then come back and say, Sir Howard, I think you need to consider this and this and this, because then the thing that you want to happen will work. And he didn't want me to just say, it's my opinion. He wanted to see the logic of what I was arguing. And actually, that's a quite quiet process. It's not about status and authority. It's actually about good, measured reasoning. And I think that can really grow your own power, because I realised, I suppose, a number of occasions in my life, I made myself very useful, because I could see that would then give me permission to do things that I wanted to do. And so I think thinking through those kinds of negotiations and building your capacity to influence rather than tell is really, really important.
Next, yeah, over there.
I have a very simple question. Would you consider changing the name of Tate Britain back to Tate Gallery?
It's a question that we have pondered many times. Not at the moment. I'm not someone that rules things out forever. But the fact that we hold 500 years of British art at Tate Britain makes it very important that is signalled. And it's a British art that's international in its dimensions and very engaged with the world, but it is about the history that we hold there, which is quite different to Tate Modern. But let me ask you, why do you think I should do that?
Gallery has a strong connotation and connection with art. But Britain is very important. Doesn't have the same effect.
Yeah. No, I can understand that. One of the other challenges for us at the moment is that Britain is quite a toxic word just now. But actually that makes me want to keep it more, because we at Tate Britain have really got to define a good version of Britain, because so many other things are not very good at the moment. So we have a kind of moral imperative to protect our nation's name.
Sure.
If I may, could I have a follow-up question about views in relation to artists like Banksy?
My views on Banksy, or yeah,
Any perspective?
well, I mean, I've seen Banksy's work in many parts of the world, and it's an extraordinary practice that lives in the street. And so I mean, hugely innovative, sending up the art world, challenging the way we think about what constitutes art, and so hugely effective and powerful. I don't think they really belong in museums particularly, because they are supposed to do their action on the street. And I think that's hugely valid. And I think one of the great things about the times that we live in now is that the art that we can embrace and enjoy is so much more plural and diverse than it has ever been. So I love anybody that comes and says, that's not art. So, probably means it is, actually, if it's causing that reaction in you. So we're able to challenge and embrace ever more diverse forms of art practice.
Yes.
Thank you for bringing up the idea of empathetic leadership that you value as a very important leadership skill. And my understanding about empathy, that you have to really understand how others people are thinking of their difficulties, and also you have to think about how to help them or where to get help for them. So, but when it comes to leadership or directorship, you have to really come down to a decision. So in this kind of situation, I was wondering how empathy could help you. Would it pose more difficulty for you to consider more? And what about how you juggle between ideas or difficulties, which is in contradictory, and for you to come down to a decision?
Yeah. Well, again, being decisive is one of those qualities that has been highly prized down the ages. But I would like to question it. I'm not convinced that it's all it's cracked up to be. Because it's quite easy to make a firm decision. This is what I'm going to do. But it isn't until one starts to notice the impact on people or the consequences of what you do that you have to live with the decisions that you've made. So there is, to me, an empathetic dimension all the time. And I've often found that the most powerful thing that a leader, not just myself, can do is to say in the face of something really difficult, I don't know what to do here. Because if you open up that space, then you start to solicit different ways of solving the problem. And I've had some very funny moments with senior colleagues where they've kind of, everyone turns to one, but so don't look at me, I've got no idea. Is actually quite liberating. Because then you can start to think together. And there comes, somebody has to, in the end, bring it to a conclusion, but often 3 brains are better than 1. And we would do well to remember that, and again, cultivate the habits by which we can listen more so that more evidence is informing the decisions that we ultimately make.
Yeah, gentlemen in the glass.
Thank you very much. This is a very enlightening talk. In your work, you have to deal with very different kinds of groups, the donors, the government, the public, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, you deal with each group accordingly to what you deal with them. What I'd like to know is, do you have a special way of dealing with media? because they are so influential in opinion. Sorry.
Yeah.
She's media, but she's
Yeah.
a good one. No, that's basically my question is, do you have a special way of dealing with media because of the influence that they have over thought processes?
Yeah. Well, this is not a way of avoiding your question, but that's often what you have to do with the press. Ignore what they say and talk about the thing that you were intending to talk about anyway. You see politicians do that all the time. So the first thing in relation to press and media is good media training is really essential, because it is easy to put your foot in it when you are faced by rapid, hostile questioning. But the skiting round the question I was going to do is, I actually don't think that the media are nearly as influential now as they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I think the power of people's views on social media is massively more powerful now. And if that's what the mainstream media chase themselves now. So they are following that trend. And in my 2 years at Tate, I feel like I've gone through a baptism of fire, because the organisation has had to learn how to deal with multiple views, shared simultaneously, pushed around the world incredibly rapidly by people that we do not know, not a journalist that's sitting in front of me, and that's just the daily reality. And one of my colleagues, the new director in Tate Liverpool, said a brilliant thing the other day to a media colleague. She said, "Oh, for goodness sake, it's only 400 likes. Don't pay any attention to that." Whereas 6 months before, we'd went, 400 likes? Oh my God. And so the whole experience is changing so very rapidly. We're having to learn new modes of behaviour, and when to listen and engage and when to stand back, and to understand that some things are just noise and then they go away just as fast, even if they feel really hurtful. And the place of the conventional media in all of that actually sometimes carries less weight now than it used to. But they are still, they're very well trained. They know how to trip you up, and they can take a simple thing that you say and turn it into something else. And a beautiful example just last week was I did an interview with Newsnight, for Newsnight in the UK, Kirsty Walk. She's a great interviewer, and she's not horrible at all. 40 minutes of interview, she asked me one question about the Sacklers, and that ended up being the lead item on Newsnight. And the interview didn't go on at all because Theresa May did her 11 o'clock press conference and the interview got bumped. But they'd still lifted out the one line that I'd said, which was a completely straightforward line about the Sacklers, but that then became multiple news stories the next day. And that's just the reality of how things work.
Hi. You've spoken very eloquently about the Tate's kind of mission and duty to the British public, the visitor, and indeed the idea of Britain. This is a question coming very much from teaching both art and the history of British art in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And most of my students will encounter your collection virtually. And you've long had a very impressive online presence, but I'm wondering about what is your digital strategy going forward, not just in terms of social media, but in terms of the virtual museum.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really, I mean, in terms of our 10-year vision, which we've been working on, we talk about dissolving the sense of difference between what you experience in our galleries, what you experience in our online environments. And also starting to think and understand about how people will encounter it on what and where. And, you know, it's a kind of headline stuff, but we talk about wanting the experience of a person accessing our collection in Hong Kong to be as good as stepping into the historic galleries in London. And we're nowhere near that yet, but it's a great aspiration to understand digital as the norm, and as an intrinsic part of how we think about the way in which people engage our collection. Because I think a related point that I feel very strongly is that I don't see that people's digital access, you hear the kind of, oh, everyone's on Instagram, no one does anything anymore. That's rubbish. The digital access provokes new kinds of social engagements. And it seems to me to be making people more curious about the objects and the histories and more able to learn about them, which is fantastic, and I want to encourage that. But Tate has more than 70,000 objects in its collection, and lots of them are very, very small bits of paper. And there's a huge task, and we used to think 10 years ago, we just thought our job is just to digitise it all and then it's there. Well, that doesn't help people access it really. Tate Shots programme, where you hear artists speaking about their work, is probably more impactful as a way of understanding the collection, or some of the fantastic walks through history that have been done. So we're learning how to make the encounter in a digital form as high quality and as beautifully rich as the experience of standing in a gallery.
We have a question over here, and
thank you for the very inspiring talk, and it's my honor and very happy to see you again so many years later after the Cultural Leadership Youth Camp in 2013. And in this year, I have been working on different cultural projects in different positions, not necessarily as a leader, but there is a common problem that I have encountered throughout my experience. It's sometimes in organizations, and I'm a person that tends to be quite talkative and have a lot of opinion, but somehow that have been considered a bit aggressive, and I don't know why. Sometimes it's more in the Asian context, bring a bit threaten what I thought to people who have been working there for so many years. Mm-hmm. And how could I handle this kind of situations and still kind of lay my plan or something? Sometimes it's a reform, not exactly as a reform, but some new ideas into our organizations. And of course, I know I need to support it by evidence and research. And another thing is sometimes it is about the bureaucratic system that makes talents in that, for example, a museum cannot function properly or cannot drive into very in-depth curatorial research and do their things. But by changing the system, a lot of stakeholders which used to be kind of beneficial from that, or they will have more work. So basically, they don't want to change. How could I face this kind of situation? Yeah. And my second question is following Dr. Alicia's question on the digitalized strategy in museum, because this morning I was listening to a talk by a curator from LACMA from LA, and they said that because we have so many online resources and the system of museum have been totally digitalized, curator does not spend their time in the storage. So they tend to continuously overlook that object that have been overlooked and not curated, for example, 13 years ago or a decade ago. What is your point of view on this? Thank you.
Okay, so the first question, I think you just have to keep doing what you're doing, because people are resistant to change. And as I said, I realise I'm part of the problem. I'm a bit old now, and I'm a bit stuck in my ways. And younger generations, very necessary complaints about the way the world is, and their wishes for the world to be different, are often resisted by older people. And I don't like to be told I'm wrong, nobody does. But actually we need to stay in that place so that across different generations, we can allow more change to happen. And so I would share one of the things that a colleague of mine at Tate said. So Tate Exchange is this place where we work with lots of different associates of all types. And sometimes it just feels like the place where people come to shout at me. And I said, you know, maybe it's not shouting. Maybe it's just a request for change. And so I think as long as you are as courteous and as gracious as I know you to be, having worked with you, you should just keep asking for that change. And the second thing is you just have to remember to sometimes to get up off the chair, stop looking at the screen or the phone, go and see the real thing. And curators need to do that, and we need to do it, is go and take yourself to another place, because you'll see something different by doing that. And to me, if we get locked in any one mode of thinking and doing, it's not going to serve us well.
Gentleman here, and I think that might be it. We want to give our speaker a rest.
Okay, so thank you for the talk. And my question is on two parts, actually, but they are mostly on inclusiveness of the use of space. The first one being, being a relaxed performance is quite a huge topic right now in the performing arts sector, where people would be enjoyed. I mean, with different disabilities or mentally or physically could enjoy theatre better in different spaces. As for fine arts, how would like Tate Modern, which is one of the leading institutes in the world, could benefit in light of these kind of ideas, could spread more ideas of inclusiveness towards disability, which everybody could literally enjoy art in various forms, by touching, by hearing, or by viewing it. Of course, art itself is a viewing object. Another part is about LGBT inclusiveness, because as you mentioned, Tate's have been a good place for hanging out on a Tinder date, for example, on a first date, which is because it's LGBT inclusive. Where in Hong Kong, at least 80% of museums and performing arts spaces are owned by government, and this government is not especially LGBT inclusive. How would you suggest like these places to be more inclusive, as, for example, as an art group or a gallery owner? How could they treat it more carefully? And how would Tate, for example, during your quest in inclusiveness, to change the space, for example, like all-gender toilet, and because it's already established that there is urinals and it's not that all-gender friendly. So how would you change that in your change? Yes.
There's loads going on in that area, and they're very good questions. Thank you. So at Tate, we have an LGBTQ plus network of staff, as well as obviously many, many visitors. And they help drive the change. So all the toilets are all gender at Tate Modern, and nearly all of them at Tate Britain. And we've got consultation down to such a T that we've learned that across the visitor and the staff base, people want all gender and not all gender toilets. And we do both, because that is the most inclusive way to deal with it, because you can't actually solve that argument. For some people, one kind are really right, and for others, they'd like it to be different. But we've got enough space within the building to accommodate both positions, which is a very good thing. And likewise, in terms of, we have a disability network who help train our staff, help guide us, but they test new parts of the building when we're developing them. At Tate Liverpool, for example, there's a whole programme of opening early for families who have children with Asperger or on the Asperger or autism spectrum, because busy museums are too challenging. And one of the bits of research and feedback we had from families was that often then divides families, because they can't go as a whole group if their autistic child finds it very stressful. And then we've developed training for staff so that they know how to respond. They are empowered to be able to do the right thing to help the family and help the child. And I just think those are part of good customer service for an inclusive institution. And in terms of your not especially LGBTQ plus friendly situation, I think the best you could do is point to examples where you see what you want. So I have a slide that I should have shown where Tate Britain, which is the classical building, it's big pillars, it's 19th century, go up the stairs. It's also the launch pad for London Pride weekend, because they don't have a building, so they take over ours for a weekend, and they light the whole thing bright pink, and they fly the rainbow flag on the top. And we're really quite close to the Palace of Westminster, and I think it's really good that we really firmly fly that flag for one weekend a year, and the kind of 24 hours round activity that happens across those weekends is being about properly inclusive to LGBTQ plus people across generations. So activities for young children starting in the morning through to very, very loud music and voguing quite late at night, and you want that spectrum. So show people who you want to persuade the pink version of Tate Britain.
Maria, I have one final question for you. This is host's privilege, so I get to ask the last question. Is it, and maybe this is a bit premature, but do you think about legacy yet? Do you think about what sort of mark you'd like to leave on the institution or on the UK or on the world in your role as director of Tate?
Well, again, that's a lovely question. And I don't quite think about it as legacy, because I am only 2 years in and I'm not intending to go anywhere just yet. But as Ariane would say, we've been mapping out the next 10 years. And I can think about where I want us to be. And I see a Tate now that has already changed the art world. You know, Frances Morris, my wonderful colleague at Tate Modern, tells a brilliant story where she said, in 2000, when Tate Modern opened, there was an aspiration to have gender parity in the contemporary collections at Tate and the contemporary displays. She said, but the reality in 2000 was there were only 3 women artists on show. Now, move forward 19 years, the contemporary collections are gender balanced. And they have also moved so far beyond the European North American paradigm to Latin America. So we've had Latin American supporters from Tate here. Our South Asian acquisition committee member was here. Asia Pacific has been part of the collecting strategy at Tate for 10 years. And so we are now telling multiple histories. We share multiple modernisms, multiple postmodernisms, and that's completely right. So that will continue. What hasn't changed between 2000 and 2019 really is who comes. It's got a bit better. Tate's about the most inclusive in terms of its audience of any national museum, but one of my staff members said, why do you want to compare yourself with rubbish? Because the baseline is very, very low. Mostly people who go to galleries and museums still are the well-educated middle classes who've already been taken. And you know, you heard my life history. I wasn't taken, and my first step into Tate Liverpool and encountering Dali changed my life. And so I believe in that as part of our kind of cultural rights. And so in 10 years' time, I would like our audiences to be much closer to the composition of the cities and towns that we're in. So we should just look like the world. I think it's quite straightforward. I'd like the people who work for Tate to look like the towns and cities that we're in, because our staff doesn't reflect the world yet. And through that, I just think we will have a much bigger impact on society, and we'll be helping to forge a better society. And I think more artists will want to work with us if we do that, because we'll be the most interesting setting. So I'd like a really democratic Tate by the end of a socially engaged, but not big P political organisation to be the one that I leave at the end.
Promise us that you will come back before the end and we can check in on the progress you've been making. But in the meantime, let me just thank you for being such a tremendous champion and for your time today. Thank you so much.